the smell of scorched wood and ancient dust, was the first thing that greeted me as I pushed open the heavy oak doors of St. Jude's Provincial School. The air inside felt thick, like it had been trapped in a tomb for 40 years, heavy with the metallic tang of iron and the sweet, cloying rot of decaying paper. I adjusted my bag on my shoulder, the weight of my teaching supplies feeling clumsy against the stillness. I was here to inventory the building before its demolition, a task that required me to stay overnight because the local authorities claimed the regional roads were unsafe for travelers after dusk. The school sat at the edge of a valley where the wind groaned through the skeletal branches of dying trees. It was a lonely place, and as I stepped onto the cracked linoleum of the main hallway, the silence was so absolute that I could hear my own heartbeat thudding against my ribs. The floorboards groaned under my boots, each creak echoing down the corridor like a low moan. My flashlight cut a yellow swath through the gloom, illuminating layers of dust that coated every surface like gray snow. I reached the first classroom and pushed the door open. It swung with a groan that set my teeth on edge. The room was filled with rows of heavy wooden desks, their surfaces scarred by decades of use. I sat at the front desk, pulling out my clipboard to begin the inventory. My task was simple: list every piece of furniture, note the condition of the walls, and document any remaining materials. But as I worked, I felt eyes upon me. It wasn't a physical sensation, but a psychological pressure, as if the very walls were watching my movements with a hungry intensity. By 6 in the evening, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. The transition from day to night was abrupt. The warmth vanished, replaced by a sudden, biting chill that seemed to seep through my clothes and into my bones. I decided to take a break and sit in the back of the room, letting my flashlight rest on the floor. That was when I heard the first sound that shouldn't have been there. It was a rhythmic scraping. Scrape, thud. Scrape, thud. It sounded like wood dragging across wood. I froze, holding my breath until my chest ached. The sound came from the classroom adjacent to mine. It was slow and deliberate, as if someone were moving something heavy with great effort. I waited for minutes, but the noise stopped just as quickly as it had begun. When I finally gathered the courage to peer through the crack in the door, I saw nothing but shadows. I returned to my desk, my hands shaking slightly. I told myself it was just the wind catching a loose shutter or an old piece of timber settling in the cooling building. But then I looked at the desks around me. In the dim light of my flashlight, I noticed that one of the chairs in the middle row was no longer tucked under its table. It had been pulled out, sitting at a crooked angle as if someone had just stood up from it. I had moved it. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. Perhaps he had moved it during my walk through the halls earlier. No, that was impossible. I was certain of the layout. I forced myself to focus on the inventory list. I began to write down the condition of the chalkboards. The one in front of me was stained with old, faded chalk marks. They were mostly illegible scribbles, but as I leaned closer, I realized they were just scribbles. They were symbols that looked like distorted faces, their eyes wide and jagged. I stood up to move to the next room, my boots clicking on the floor. As I moved, I heard a distinct thud behind me. It was the sound of a heavy book hitting the floor. I spun around, my flashlight beams swinging wildly. The beam landed on a desk 3 rows back. A heavy, letter-bound ledger lay on the floor next to it. It was the attendance book. I had seen it in the hallway earlier, but I hadn't noticed it lying here. I walked toward it, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I picked up the book and opened it. The pages were yellowed and brittle, crumbling slightly at the edges. I expected to see a list of names for the current year, or perhaps the years leading up to the school's closure. Instead, the first page I turned was dated 1974. The headers were written in a frantic, jagged hand, roll call for the final assembly. I began to read the names. They weren't just names, they were dates and descriptions. Each name was followed by a small, underlined note. Elias present, Mateo present, Lucia present, but further down the list, the notes changed. Sophia missing, Hugo gone. I kept reading, my eyes blurring as the names began to repeat in a rhythmic pattern. There were dozens of them, all listed under the date of October 12th. Then I saw the mention of the fire. A large, scorched stamp across the center of the page read, "The great fire all present accounted for in ashes." The ink was faded, but the words were clear. My hands began to tremble so violently that the book nearly slipped from my grip. The dates on the ledger didn't match the history I had researched. The fire was supposed to have happened in 1982, not the 70. But more importantly, the names, they weren't just old names. Some of them were written in a script that looked like it had been carved into the paper with something sharper than a pen. A sudden draft blew through the room, smelling of smoke and burnt hair. I gasped, my eyes watering. The sound of the wind outside seemed to intensify, howling through the eaves like a choir of mourners. I slammed the book shut and shoved it onto a desk. I needed to leave this room. I needed to get to the main office and find my supplies for the morning. I stepped out into the hallway, but the layout felt wrong. The corridor seemed longer than it had been an hour ago. Every door I passed seemed to be slightly ajar by just a fraction of an inch. From behind those doors, I could hear faint whispers, muffled voices that sounded like children trying to speak through heavy blankets. They weren't words I could understand. They were just the soft, rhythmic sounds of speech. I reached the end of the hall where my supplies were kept. I entered the storage room and sat on a crate, trying to steady my breathing. The silence here was different. It was heavy and expectant. I sat in the dark for what felt like minutes, then an hour, until the fear became so sharp it felt like a physical weight on my chest. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam hit the wall opposite me. My heart skipped a beat. On the far wall of the storage room, there was a drawing. It wasn't something that had been there before. It was a crude, charcoal-style sketch of a tall figure with elongated limbs and no face, standing over a pile of small, huddled shapes. The lines were thick and jagged, as if drawn in a state of extreme agitation. I turned my light to the other side of the room. There was another one. This time it was a drawing of a schoolhouse, but the windows were filled with orange flames. Below the image, in large, shaky letters, were the words, "We are still in class." The realization hit me like a physical blow. These weren't just random marks. They were being produced by something in this building, something that fed on the history of the tragedy. I stood up and walked toward the door, my legs feeling like lead. Every step I took away from the storage room felt like pulling myself out of deep mud. The walls seemed to lean inward, the ceiling drooping as if the weight of the memories was crushing the structure. I made it back to my original classroom. I didn't want to stay in the hallway anymore. I wanted to be somewhere with a solid door. But when I entered the room, I stopped dead. The desks were no longer in their rows. They had been moved into a circle in the center of the room, all facing inward toward a single point on the floor. The first desk was tipped over. The second one was overturned as well. And then there was the third. It wasn't just tipped. It was smashed, its wood splintered as if something heavy had slammed into it. My flashlight flickered and dimmed, the beam becoming a weak, dying orange glow. I could hear footsteps, now not the slow drag of wood, but the rapid, frantic patter of small feet running across the floorboards. Patter, patter, patter. They were coming from the back of the room. I swung my light toward the sound. The beam caught something moving behind a row of cabinets. It was a blur of gray and brown, moving with a sickening, jerky motion. It wasn't human, but it moved with the intent of a child. It darted behind a heavy oak desk, and then another movement came from the left side of the room. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I grabbed my heavy flashlight like a club. "Who's there?" I shouted. My voice cracked, echoing off the high ceiling. The sound of my voice seemed to cause the room to react. A low moan vibrated through the floorboards, and several desks began to slide across the floor with a screeching grind of wood on stone. They were moving toward me, closing the circle. I backed away, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The movement was rhythmic now. Slide, grind, slide. They weren't just moving randomly, they were encroaching. The desks were moving faster now, their legs screeching against the floor like screaming voices. I retreated until my back hit the chalkboard at the front of the room. I looked up at the board. In the seconds since I had entered the room, someone or something had been writing on it. Large chunks of white chalk were falling off as new symbols appeared. They weren't just marks anymore. They were depictions of a fire. Huge, billowing clouds of smoke were being drawn in frantic lines, and small figures were shown huddled beneath what looked like collapsing beams. And then the names began to appear, the same names from the attendance book. They were appearing one by one, larger and bolder than before. Elena, Marcus, Tessa, Leo. The chalk was flying across the board, hitting it with such force that bits of stone flew off. It wasn't being written by a hand. It was as if the board were weeping the names of the dead. I turned my head and saw the silhouettes in the back of the room. They weren't figures in the shadows anymore. They were standing. They were small, gray shapes that looked like children whose skin had been charred to leather. Their eyes were nothing but hollow pits of soot. They stood by the desks, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. They didn't move toward me. Instead, they began to hum. It was a low, dissonant drone that vibrated in my teeth and made my ears bleed. It was the sound of children trying to sing a song they had forgotten the words to. The pitch shifted, rising and falling like the crackle of a flame. I tried to scream, but the smoke began to fill the room. It didn't come from a fire, it simply materialized out of the air, thick and acrid. It tasted of ash and old copper. I coughed, my lungs burning as if I were inhaling hot coals. My flashlight flickered and died completely. In the pitch black, the humming grew louder. It was no longer a drone, it was a chorus. Dozens of voices, some high and sweet, some cracked and raspy, all blending into a singular, haunting wail. The smell of smoke became overwhelming, making my eyes water so much I could barely see my own hands in front of my face. I scrambled toward the door, my hands clawing at the wood. I felt something brush against my shoulder, a small, cold hand that felt like a piece of dry leather. I screamed and threw myself forward, crashing through the door into the hallway. I didn't stop running. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, stumbling over debris and overturned chairs until I reached the heavy main doors of the school. I burst outside into the night air. The cold hit me like a physical blow, and I gasped for breath, the fresh air stinging my throat. I didn't stop until I was at the edge of the property, far from the looming shadow of the school. I sat in the dirt, shivering, my clothes smelling of soot and old dust. The moon was high now, casting a cold, silver light over the valley. The silence of the night returned, but it wasn't the same as before. It felt heavy with the weight of what I had seen. I looked back at the school. In the highest window of the main hall, a single light flickered, a dull, orange glow that looked like a flame dancing in the wind. I stayed there until the sun began to rise over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gray. When the first rays of light hit the school, the orange glow in the window vanished. I walked back to my car, my hands still shaking so much I could barely turn the key in the ignition. I didn't go home that day. I sat in a diner 3 towns over, wrapping a heavy blanket around my shoulders. The smell of smoke still clung to my hair, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the names on the chalkboard. They weren't just names, they were memories of children who had never left their classroom. Weeks later, I finally received an email from the project coordinator asking for my report. I didn't write about the inventory of desks or the condition of the walls. I didn't mention the attendance book or the drawings on the chalkboard. I simply wrote one sentence: the building is not empty. I never went back to that school. But sometimes in the middle of the night, when the wind is high and the air turns cold, I can still hear it. It isn't a sound from outside my window. It's a faint, distant humming coming from inside my own head, a chorus of small voices singing a song about fire and ash. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see a thin layer of gray sit on my collar, as if I had been standing in a room that was still burning, waiting for someone to tell me it was time to go home. The drawing on the wall stayed with me more than the images themselves. It wasn't just a figure, it was an invitation. Every time I close my eyes, I see those blacker than black eyes and the way they seem to find me in the dark of that room. They weren't looking at the woman with the flashlight, they were looking at the soul behind the lens. I found a piece of paper on my nightstand this morning. It wasn't there when I went to sleep. It was a scrap of yellowed, brittle paper, like a page torn from an old book. On it, in a script that looked like it had been carved into the surface with a jagged stone, was a single name. It wasn't one of the names from the list of children. It was my name, written in charcoal that still smelled of smoke and old, dying wood. I don't look at the paper anymore. I keep it tucked inside a book on my shelf. But sometimes, when the wind howls outside, I can hear the faint sound of a pencil scratching against something. It's as if someone is sitting in the chair across from me, slowly rewriting my name into their ledger, ensuring that when the next fire comes, they will know exactly where to find me. The school stands on the hill, its windows like blind eyes watching the road. They said it would be torn down by the end of the month. They say the land is being cleared for a new park. But some things don't leave just because you move the ground they stand on. Some fires never truly go out. They just wait for more fuel to join the flames. I can still taste the ash in my mouth every morning when I wake up. It's a lingering reminder of that night in the classroom where time stopped and the past refused to stay buried. The shadow of those children follows me like a shroud. They are not gone. They are simply waiting for the doors to open again, for the next teacher to arrive, and for someone to read their names out loud one more time. I find myself checking the locks on my door every night now. I stay away from old buildings and dusty attics. But sometimes, when the house is very quiet, I hear a soft, rhythmic thud in the hallway. Scrape, thud. Scrape, thud. It sounds like wood dragging across floorboards, moving toward my bedroom door. I sit up in bed and listen to the silence, and in that silence, I can just barely hear it, the low, dissonant hum of a dozen voices joined together. They aren't singing anymore. They are whispering. They are calling out my name over and over until the words lose their shape and become nothing more than the sound of fire crackling in a dry room. I look at my hands in the moonlight and see the faint gray smudge on my knuckles. It doesn't wash off with soap. It doesn't fade with time. It is a stain from a place where the air was thick with soot and the children were still waiting for someone to hear them. I know that if I listen closely enough, I can hear the scratching of chalk on a board just beyond my reach, marking another name in the book of those who will never leave. The school's fate is irrelevant now. Whether it stands or falls, the room remains. The desks move in their circle and the names remain on the list, and every night, I am invited back to sit at the front, to hold my pen, and to watch as the drawing of the tall figure grows larger on the wall behind me. It is getting closer. It wants me to understand that some places don't just keep memories. They consume them, turning everything into ash until there is nothing left but the soot of what used to be human. The last thing I see before I fall asleep is not my room. It is a flickering orange light in a darkened hall. It is the sound of paper burning. It is the sight of a girl's face, charred and beautiful, looking at me from across a pile of broken desks. She isn't screaming. She is simply waiting for me to join her in the choir. The fire isn't behind me anymore. It is inside me. It is the only thing that keeps me warm when the winter of my solitude sets in. I can hear them now, even without trying. They are just outside the door, their voices a soft, crackling hiss like wood in a furnace. They aren't hungry for my body, they are hungry for my presence. They want to be included in the count. They want me to be the next name on the page that was burned. I reach out and touch the wall beside my bed, and for a moment it feels not like plaster and wood, but like scorched timber, hot and rough against my palm. The silence of the night is no longer quiet. It is filled with the crackle of phantom flames and the heavy, suffocating weight of a history that refused to stay in the past. I close my eyes, and the school appears before me, its doors wide open, inviting me back into the circle. The desks are waiting. The chalk is ready. The names are missing one more entry, and as the scent of smoke fills my lungs once again, I realize that the night at the provincial school never really ended for those who walked through its doors. It just waited for someone to follow them in.